I'm Teresa Piacentini, and this is lecture 6, part 1, in topic 2, self-society and belonging. And in this lecture, we will be looking at the key sociological concept of community. And the first thing to say about community, it is absolutely one of those concepts where there is a lot of traffic between it being used as a category of practice and a category of analysis. And the aim of this part of the recording will be to define and debate the very concept. So let's begin by looking at how we might define community. So it's a term that's usually referred to types of population settlements, such as villages or physically bounded urban neighbourhoods. It is also used to refer to supposedly ideal typical ways of life in such places. And it is often used to describe or to define social networks whose members share some common characteristic apart from or in addition to a common location, such as ethnicity or occupation. And frequently the term is used in ways which contain all of these elements. For example, it may be used to describe traditional inner city working class communities. And Bell and Newby in 1971 identified some common key aspects that can often be distinguished in relation to community. So common characteristics were around territory, close and informal relationships, mutuality, common values and beliefs, organised interaction, strong group feeling, cultural similarity, a sense of belonging or community spirit. And so what we can see here are a number of different things. They may be linked to place, so this idea of territory, geographical or having a spatial focus. It may be linked to institutions such as families and schools, community centres, or to parent families or churches, mosques, faith groups, neighbourhood groups. And community evokes usually a sense of belonging of some kind, an informally organised social entity which is characterised by a sense of identity, so feelings of social bonds and patterns of behaviour that reflect those bonds. Although this does raise a question about whether we all belong equally in these communities. And as we've looked at before, sociological concepts are historical and contested, and community is no different. So let's think about why the concept of community might be contested. Well, it is a problematic and elusive concept. It has been the concern of sociologists for over 200 years, and yet we still can't seem to have an agreed definition or a satisfactory definition in sociological terms of what it is. So the first thing to say here is that there's definitional ambiguity. Hillary, writing in 1955, identified then 94 meanings used by sociologists. And it has never really held a privileged place in the social sciences. And why not? Well, the fact that there is no clear and widely accepted definition of just what characteristic features of social interaction constitute the types of solidaristic relations typical of so-called communities. It is argued that it is one of those terms that has come to mean everything, but when unpacked and unpicked, it means very little. And it often fails to reflect both social diversity out with and diversity within, which raises important questions of power. There is also an empirical question here in how we identify communities. How is community quantified and qualified? How might it be measured? Communities are often seen as sites of commonality, but also exclusion. This necessarily must imply that one, members of a group have something in common with each other, that secondly, distinguishes them in a significant way from members of other so-called groups. If communities are about shared characteristics, they also have to be about difference. Community is contested because it has a kind of affective appeal. There is an effective emotional content to this notion of community its apparent ability to explain what connects us to others, even when it does exclude some, that gives it continuing relevance, a particular adaptability, and indeed a constant appeal in academic discourse, in political and popular discourse. We often think of it as something lost to be found, and it can take on, especially most recently, I would say, a kind of nostalgic quality, a yearning for something that never really existed. It is also used to categorize in quite a specific way, but it doesn't really tell us about how people self identify. Now, if we think back to the very first lecture in this topic around categorization and self identification, we should be questioning whether people within these so-called communities identify themselves as such. For example, if we talk about the Asians, the Jews, the Irish, this seems impolite, disrespectful, prejudiced even. But if we add community, then there's a kind of magical quality here. We seem to value the group thus categorized, the Jewish community, the Asian community, the Irish community. Rogers Brubaker, writing in 2013, and this is on the reading list, interrogated how the Muslim community was categorized and whether individuals thus categorized self-identified in the same way. And this helps us trace then the historical and contested nature of community. So these points reflect just some of the challenges in thinking sociologically about community. And as Zygmunt Bauman says, community is one of those words. It feels good. It has a kind of, takes on a kind of idealized nature. He argues that words have meanings and some do have this kind of feel, and community is one of those words. It's good to have. It always seems like a better thing to aspire to than society. It seems to be a place where people look out for each other, a safety net. But, as Bauman argues, there's also a price to pay for this security, which is our freedom. If we want warmth and safety, then we need to fix alarms and put locks on windows, and we mustn't talk to strangers. And if we think of the example of a gated community, then those on the inside may feel part of something, but it's a very clear physical and symbolic message to others to keep out. And this price that we pay means that as a result, those who can afford it can take advantage of a number of security mechanisms to protect community. So living in gated communities, for example, installing surveillance cameras, hiring private security. The architecture of the modern city has become one of segregating the haves from the have-nots. And these kind of barrier strategies exist in the everyday context, but also more broadly, if we think about Fortress Europe, which was seen as a kind of a community of Europeans without walls, which has changed in recent years. And there is something about this idea of networks and norms and sanctions that we invest in and we buy into in community. So the networks may be our neighbours, the norms are the due care of property, the challenging strangers who may turn up in a neighbourhood, and we can see this in community Facebook groups, for example. And then we have sanctions, so gossip and social exclusion as a result of anyone breaching the idealised notion of what a community has come to represent. And I think it does lead to these kind of questions around whether living in a certain community, does it affect the living standards and values of the people living there? And what about gated communities that don't have actual gates? And these images I'm showing you here, the one in the top is a largely white middle-class suburban area of Glasgow, a new build estate with manicured lawns where houses look relatively similar to each other. You need a car to travel about. It is made up of a range of cul-de-sacs with pretty names. But if you think about the cul-de-sac, so it's a one way to go that unless you are going to be on this street, you've no business being there. These are places where there's a lack of outsiders and there's a specific territoriality, and arguably perhaps a lack of connectivity to the outside world. But what kind of neighbourliness is this that can develop there? And is it one that only looks in on itself? Is it a community within a community? And I wanted to contrast this with the second picture below, which is a photograph of one of the most ethnically diverse neighbourhoods in Scotland. And what we have here is a traditional street grid with local amenities, tenement buildings with shops underneath, established public transport routes, tenement living, shared back lawns. So we see connectivity and a neighbourhood that also looks in on itself, but perhaps in different ways. So the one on the top is a neighbourhood that's closed off without being a gated community, and then the one on the bottom is one that is very much open, but still maintains a sense of networks, norms, and sanctions. So I'm going to end this part of the lecture here. And in the next part of this lecture, we will be looking at different ways in which community has come to be understood in the sociological literature.